Alien girl flees ruthless beast, pleads for shelter in human's cabin. The rain fell in heavy sheets over Voronine, a wild planet of endless jungles and jagged cliffs, its twin suns hidden behind thick, churning clouds. Jake stood at the edge of his cabin's porch, a sturdy shelter he built from the bones of his crashed scout ship 3 years ago. The wind howled through the glowing trees, their leaves shimmering with faint blue light, casting eerie shadows across the muddy ground. At 35, Jake was a man shaped by solitude. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd left the colonial fleet after one too many orders to burn villages or clear forests for profit. Now this was his world. Just him, the storms, and the strange life forms he'd learned to outsmart. He wiped rain from his face and adjusted the scanner on his wrist, a salvaged piece of tech that beeped softly, tracking the weather. A storm was rolling in fast, the kind that turned the rivers to torrents and flooded the lowlands. Jake turned to head inside when a sound cut through the rain. A sharp, frantic pounding on his cabin door. He froze. In 3 years, nothing had ever come knocking. The nearest outpost was hundreds of miles away, and the local creatures avoided his territory after he'd rigged electric traps to teach them a lesson. The pounding grew louder, joined by a voice, high and desperate. "Please, let me in. It's coming." Jake's hand hovered over the knife at his belt. He edged toward the door, peering through a small viewport he'd installed. A figure stood there, tall and slender, cloaked in the rain's shimmer. Not human. Her skin gleamed a soft silver, catching the faint light from the trees, and her hair glowed a deep orange, plastered wet against her face. She slammed her fist against the door again, her wide golden eyes locking onto his through the glass. "Who are you?" Jake shouted, his voice rough from disuse. "How'd you get here?" "Please," she begged, her accent strange but clear. "It's chasing me. I can't fight it alone." Before he could answer, a roar ripped through the storm, deep and guttural, shaking the ground beneath his boots. The woman flinched, glancing back into the dark jungle. Jake's scanner flared. A massive heat signature was closing in. Fast. Whatever was out there was big, and it wasn't stopping. Against every instinct screaming to keep his door shut, Jake flipped the lock and yanked it open. The woman stumbled inside, collapsing to her knees as rain pooled around her. Jake slammed the door shut and engaged the reinforced bolts just as something massive crashed against it. The cabin shuddered, but the walls, built from ship-grade polymer, held firm. He grabbed a plasma torch from the wall, a makeshift weapon he'd rigged from spare parts, and spun to face her. "Start talking," he growled, keeping the torch aimed at her chest. "What's out there, and why's it after you?" She pushed herself up, breathing hard. Up close, she was striking, taller than him by a few inches, with sharp features and those glowing golden eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Her clothes, a torn, shimmering fabric, clung to her frame, revealing lean muscle and a few cuts oozing a faint, silvery blood. "My name's Leela," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm from Corin, a world your people destroyed. That thing out there, it's a vortex stalker. It was made to hunt me." Jake's grip tightened on the torch. "Made? By who?" "A corporation." Lila spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "Vortex Industries. They wiped out my people for our genes, something in us they want to sell. I'm the last one left. They sent that beast to drag me back." Another crash rocked the cabin, louder this time. Jake glanced at the structural display on his workbench. A green light blinked, showing the walls were still intact. He turned back to Leela, mind racing. 3 years alone had honed his survival skills, but it had also dulled his trust. She could be lying, a trap set by scavengers or worse. But that roar wasn't fake, and the heat signature on his scanner was unlike anything he'd seen on Voronine. "Why should I believe you?" he demanded. "You show up out of nowhere, and now I've got a monster at my door. Leela met his gaze, unflinching. Because if you don't help me, it'll break in and kill us both. It won't stop until I'm dead, or it is. A low growl rumbled outside, vibrating through the floor. Jake risked a glance through the viewport. In the rain, two glowing red eyes stared back, set in a hulking shape nearly 10 feet tall. Its body shimmered, shifting colors like oil on water, and its claws gleamed, dripping with something that smoked when it hit the ground. Jake cursed under his breath. He'd faced predators here, venomous crawlers, razor-winged birds, but nothing like this. "All right," he said finally, lowering the torch but keeping it ready. "You're in, but you're explaining everything. Now." Lila nodded, brushing wet hair from her face. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would help me on this forsaken planet." She sank onto a crate near the wall, exhaustion clear in her slumped shoulders. "The stalker's a bioweapon. Vortex Industries bred it to track my kind by scent. Our DNA. They crashed here a week ago, chasing me after I escaped their ship. I've been running ever since." Jake paced, processing her words. Vortex Industries. He'd heard of them. A biotech giant with a reputation for ruthless experiments. During his fleet days, he'd seen their ships hovering over ruined worlds, stripping them bare. "So you're what? A lab rat on the run?" "More like a prize," she said bitterly. "My people could heal fast, adapt to anything. They think I'm the key to some immortality drug. That's why they won't let me go." The cabin shook again as the stalker slammed its bulk against the door. Jake checked the display. Stress levels were climbing. "Great," he muttered. "So I've got a corporate killing machine outside my house because you were too valuable to die quietly." Leela's eyes narrowed. "I didn't ask to be hunted. But if you want me gone, give me a weapon. I'll face it myself." Her defiance caught him off guard. He studied her for a moment, then tossed her a spare knife from his workbench. "Not yet. If that thing's as smart as you say, we're both dead unless we work together." She caught the blade, testing its weight with a nod. Outside, the stalker circled, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Jake moved to his workbench, pulling up a map of the area on his cracked tablet. "This cabin's held off storms and beasts before," he said. "But that thing's different. We need a plan." Leela joined him, her silver skin glinting in the cabin's dim light. "It's fast, strong, and it learns. We can't just hide." "Then we don't," Jake said, a spark of determination igniting in his chest. "We fight, or we make it wish it never found us." For the first time in years, his quiet life was gone, replaced by a challenge he couldn't ignore. And deep down, a part of him welcomed it. The cabin trembled as the vortex stalker slammed against the walls again, its roars blending with the storm's howling wind. Jake stood at his workbench, hands steady despite the chaos, calibrating a motion sensor he'd ripped from his old ship's navigation system. The dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. Leela crouched near the viewport, peering into the rain-soaked jungle of Voronine, her silver skin reflecting the faint blue glow of the trees outside. The knife Jake had given her rested in her hand, gripped tightly as she tracked the beast's movements. "It's testing us," she said, her voice low but firm. "The stalker's smart. It's looking for a weak spot." Another thud shook the cabin, and a faint crackling sound came from the rear wall. Jake glanced at the structural display. A yellow warning blinked, showing stress fractures forming in the polymer panels. 3 years of storms hadn't broken his home, but this creature was something else. "Tell me more about it," Jake said, not looking up from his work. "What's it made of? How do we stop it?" He needed facts, something he could use. His years alone had taught him that knowledge was the best weapon against the unknown. Leela moved closer, her golden eyes sharp with focus. "The Vortex Stalker's a bioweapon. Part machine, part monster. Vortex Industries built it to hunt my people. It's got reinforced bones, skin that shifts to blend into anything, and claws laced with acid. It tracks me by my DNA, my scent, and it doesn't stop. Ever. Jake cursed under his breath, finishing the sensor and hooking it to his tablet. So it's a killing machine with a nose for you. Great house guest you brought me. He flashed her a grim half-smile, but his mind was already racing. He'd faced tough odds before. Pirates, storms, starvation. But this was a new level of trouble. Layla didn't flinch at his jab. If I could have outrun it, I wouldn't be here. But it's been chasing me for days. I'm tired, Jake. I can't keep going alone. Her honesty hit him harder than the stalker's attacks. She wasn't begging anymore. She was offering him a chance to fight back. Then we don't run, Jake said, standing and grabbing a coil of wire from a crate. We hold it off. Make it regret coming here. He pointed to the cabin's walls. These panels are tough, but they won't last forever. We need to reinforce them. Buy time to think. Leela nodded, rising with a grace that belied her exhaustion. I can help. My people were builders, scientists. I know how to strengthen things. She glanced around the cluttered room, spotting a pile of metal scraps and a welding torch. What's your plan? Jake liked her quick thinking. We brace the weak spots with these, he said, tossing her a slab of hull plating. Then we rig some surprises. I've got traps outside, electric grids, but that thing's too smart to stumble into them blind. We need something bigger. They worked fast, moving like a team despite having just met. Jake hauled the heavy plating to the rear wall while Leela used the torch, her hand steady as she fused the metal to the cracking panels. The stalker prowled outside, its massive shadow sliding past the viewport, red eyes glinting through the rain. Every few minutes it ran the cabin again, testing their defenses. The yellow warning on the display turned orange, stress levels climbing. It's learning, Leela said, wiping sweat from her brow as she finished a weld. It'll find the weakest points soon. Her voice carried a mix of fear and determination, and Jake couldn't help but admire her grit. She'd been running for days, yet here she was, fighting beside him. Then we stay one step ahead, Jake replied, rigging a spare battery to the wire coil. He'd built a crude shock barrier years ago to keep smaller predators away. Now he cranked its voltage, hoping it might slow the stalker. This'll zap anything that gets too close. Might not kill it, but it'll hurt. Leela watched him work, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. On Corin, we used sound to scare off predators. High frequencies, they hated it. Do you have anything like that? Jake paused, then grinned. You're full of ideas, aren't you? He dug through a storage bin and pulled out a busted comms unit from his ship. This thing's got a speaker. If I tweak it, we can blast noise loud enough to rattle its skull. Good thinking. She returned a faint smile, the first he'd seen from her. We had to be clever to survive. Until we couldn't. Her voice dipped, a shadow of loss crossing her face, but she shook it off and grabbed a tool to help him. Together, they turned the comms unit into a sonic weapon, boosting its output with a spare power cell. The cabin shook again, harder this time, and the display flashed red. A hairline crack split one of the rear panels, letting in a trickle of rain. Jake swore and grabbed his plasma torch. It's breaking through. We need to move faster. Leela pointed to the ceiling. What about up there? Can we reinforce it too? Jake followed her gaze. The roof was thinner, salvaged plating he'd never bothered to thicken. If the stalker climbed up, it could smash right through. Good catch, he said, impressed again. He dragged a ladder from the corner and climbed up, bolting extra metal over the weak spots while Leela fed him supplies. The stalker's growls grew louder, closer, and then silence. Jake froze, peering through a skylight. The jungle glowed softly, but the beast was gone from sight. It's planning something, Leela whispered, clutching the knife. It does this. Goes quiet before it strikes. Jake slid down the ladder, heart pounding. Then we hit it first. He activated the shock barrier, sending a low hum through the cabin's exterior, and cranked the sonic weapon to full power. Get ready." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until a deafening roar erupted from behind the cabin. The stalker charged, its massive form crashing into the rear wall. The reinforced panel buckled but held, and the shock barrier flared, sending the jolt through the beast. It shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and stumbled back, smoke rising from its claws. "Now," Jake shouted. Leela flipped the sonic weapon switch, and a piercing wail blasted through the cabin, so loud it made Jake's ears ring. Outside, the stalker thrashed, clawing at its head as the sound drove it wild. For a moment, it retreated, vanishing into the glowing trees. Jake let out a shaky breath. That worked. For now. He checked the display. Structural damage was high, but they bought time. Lila sank against the wall, her silver skin pale with exhaustion. "It'll come back," she said. "It always does." "Then we'll be ready," Jake replied, but his confidence faltered as his scanner beeped. A second heat signature blinked onto the screen, bigger than the first, moving through the jungle toward them. "You didn't mention there were two," he said, voice tight. Leela's eyes widened in horror. "There weren't. They must have sent another." She gripped the knife harder. "Two vortex stalkers. We can't fight that." Jake stared at the screen, then at the cabin's battered walls. His quiet life was gone, shredded by corporate greed and alien monsters. But something in him, a stubborn human spark, refused to give up. "We gon' fight," he said, a plan forming. "We outsmart them. You said they track your DNA, right?" She nodded, confused. "Yes. Why?" "Because we're going to use that against them." He grabbed a med kit from his workbench and pulled out a syringe. "We take some of your blood, make a decoy, lure them away from here and into a trap." Leela hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve, exposing a faint shimmer of silver veins. "You're crazy," she said, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I like it." Jake drew the blood, mixing it with a chemical gel to amplify its scent. As he worked, the second stalker's roar echoed through the trees, closer now, joining its partner. The cabin wouldn't survive a double assault, not for long. "We've got one shot," he said, sealing the decoy in a canister. "I'll lead them off. You stay here, keep this place standing." "No," Leela cut in, fierce. "We do this together. I'm not hiding while you risk your life." He met her gaze, seeing the same stubbornness he felt in himself. After a beat, he nodded. "Fine. Together." The stalker's roars grew louder, a deadly promise in the night. Jake grabbed his torch and the decoy, a wild grin tugging at his lips. "Let's give them a chase they'll never forget." The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a fire had ignited. Two unlikely allies ready to defy the odds with nothing but their wits and a flicker of trust. The jungle of Voronine glowed under the twin moons, its trees pulsing with blue and green light as Jake and Leela slipped out of the cabin's emergency hatch. Rain hammered the ground, turning it into a slick, muddy mess, but Jake moved with purpose, the decoy canister humming in his hand. Leela followed close behind, her silver skin catching the faint glow, her golden eyes scanning the shadows. The vortex stalker's roars echoed through the trees, one near the cabin, the other circling closer, two relentless hunters driven by corporate greed and Lila's unique blood. Jake clutched his plasma torch in one hand, the decoy in the other, its signal pulsing stronger now, broadcasting Lila's scent into the night. "The ravine's 2 miles east," he said, his voice low but steady. "Narrow walls, steep drop. If we can get them in there, we drop the cliffs on their heads." Leela nodded, gripping the knife he'd given her. "It could work, but they're fast and smart. We can't let them catch us first." Her breath came in short bursts, her exhaustion clear, but she kept pace with him, her determination matching his own. "Then we don't stop moving," Jake said, pushing through the undergrowth. The jungle was alive around them. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. But the stalker's growls drowned it all out. Jake's boots sank into the mud, but he knew this terrain. 3 years of scavenging and surviving had mapped it in his mind. He led them toward a winding path, dodging glowing vines that snapped like whips if you got too close. Behind them, the first stalker burst through the trees, its massive form tearing branches apart. Its red eyes locked onto Jake, drawn by the decoy signal. It was bigger than he'd realized. 12 feet tall, its shimmering skin blending with the jungle until it moved. Acid dripped from its claws, sizzling as it hit the ground. "Here we go," Jake muttered, breaking into a run. Layla stayed at his side, her longer strides keeping up despite her fatigue. The second stalker's roar came from the left, cutting through the rain. A coordinated attack. "They're splitting us up," Leela shouted, ducking under a low branch. "One chases, the other flanks." "Not if we stick together," Jake shot back. He veered right, toward a cluster of towering rocks he'd used as a lookout before. "Climb." They scrambled up the slick stone, Jake hauling Leela up when her footing slipped. From the top, he saw both stalkers closing in, their movements eerily sensed. He cranked the decoy's output to full, tossing it down the path toward the ravine. "That'll pull them east. Move." They slid down the other side and sprinted through the jungle, the decoy's signal luring the beasts behind them. The ravine loomed ahead, a jagged scar in the earth, its walls rising sharp and steep. Jake had scouted it months ago. A natural trap if he could make it work. He pulled explosive charges from his pack, crude bombs he'd made from ship fuel cells and wiring, and handed half to Leela. "Set these along the left wall. I'll take the right. When they're in, we blow it." Leela took the charges, her hand steady despite the chaos. "You humans love blowing things up, don't you?" she said, a faint spark of humor in her voice. "It's a talent," Jake replied, flashing a grin. They split up, racing along the ravine's edges. Jake wedged his charges into cracks in the rock, rigging them with a remote trigger he'd salvaged from his ship's comms. The ground shook as the stalkers neared, their roars bouncing off the stone walls. He glanced across the ravine. Leela moved fast, planting her bombs with precision, her alien agility shining through. The first stalker reached the ravine's mouth, sniffing the air, its eyes narrowing as it zeroed in on Jake. The decoy had done its job. They were here, but now it was personal. "Come on, you ugly bastard," Jake muttered, waving the torch to keep its attention. The second stalker appeared higher up, climbing the ravine's edge, its claws digging into the rock like it was soft dirt. "They're in position." Leela yelled, finishing her last charge and sprinting back toward him. Jake nodded, backing deeper into the ravine to draw them in. The first stalker charged, its massive bulk filling the narrow passage, while the second prowled above, waiting to pounce. Jake's heart pounded. This had to work, or they were dead. "Now," he shouted, hitting the trigger. The charges exploded in a chain of deafening blasts, fire and smoke erupting along the ravine walls. Rocks tumbled down, an avalanche of stone crashing toward the stalkers. The first beast roared as boulders slammed into its back, pinning it under a pile of rubble. The second, higher up, took the full force, tons of rock burying it in an instant. Dust choked the air, and for a moment, silence fell. Jake coughed, waving the smoke away as he climbed toward Leela. "You okay?" he called, reaching her side. She nodded, brushing dirt from her silver skin, her golden eyes bright with adrenaline. "It worked," she said, almost disbelieving. "One's down, maybe both." But as the dust settled, a low growl rumbled through the ravine. The first stalker clawed its way free, blood-like fluid oozing from its wounds, its red eyes glowing with rage. It wasn't dead, just angrier. "Guess we're not that lucky," Jake said, gripping his torch. The second was buried, but this one was still a threat. Leela stepped forward, knife raised. "We finish it, together." Her voice was steel, and Jake saw something new in her, a fire he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just prey anymore. She was ready to fight. The stalker lunged, faster than its size suggested, its claws slashing through the air. Jake dove aside, firing the torch, a weak burst of plasma that scorched its hide but didn't stop it. Lila darted in, slashing its leg with her knife, drawing a hiss of acidic blood that burned the ground. The beast swiped at her, and she rolled away, barely dodging its reach. "It's too strong ascendant free for Al," Jake shouted, swinging the torch again, aiming for its eyes, one of the weak spots Lila had mentioned. The plasma hit true, searing into the stalker's left eye. It shrieked, thrashing in pain, giving them a fleeting chance. The throat. Lila yelled, "Get its throat." Jake charged, adrenaline surging, and leaped onto a fallen rock for height. The stalker snapped at him, its jaws wide, revealing the glistening, vulnerable throat. He thrust the torch forward, jamming it deep and firing. The beast convulsed, choking as plasma burned through its flesh, then collapsed, its massive body shuddering before going still. Jake slid down, panting, and met Lila's gaze. "Told you we'd make it regret this," he said, wiping sweat and mud from his face. She laughed, a short, sharp sound of relief. "You're insane, human. But I'm glad you are." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, a quiet thanks in her touch. But the victory was short-lived. Jake's scanner beeped, a faint signal pulsing from the buried stalker's wreckage. "That's not good," he muttered, checking the reading. It was a tracker, still active, broadcasting their location. Lila's face darkened. "Vortex Industries. They'll know we killed their pets. They'll send more. Soldiers, ships. They won't stop." Jake stared at the jungle, then back at her. "Then we don't stop either. My ship's wreck's half a mile north. If we can salvage it, we've got a fighting chance." Lila's eyes hardened with resolve. "Lead the way. I'm not running anymore. I'm fighting." Jake grinned, a wild edge to it. "That's the spirit. Let's give 'em hell." They turned north, the glowing jungle stretching ahead, danger and possibility intertwined. The stalkers were down, but the real battle was just beginning. And Jake wouldn't have it any other way. The jungle of Voronine stretched endlessly before Jake and Lila as they trekked north, the glow of the trees fading into a gray dawn. Rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was thick with tension. Jake led the way, his boots crunching over fallen branches, the plasma torch slung over his shoulder, and his pack heavy with scavenged gear. Lila kept pace beside him, her silver skin streaked with mud, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. The death of one vortex stalker and the burial of the other had bought them time, but the tracker's signal pulsed faintly in Jake's scanner, a silent promise that Vortex Industries wasn't done with them. "We're close," Jake said, pointing to a ridge ahead. "My ship crashed there 3 years ago. If anything's left, we can use it." His voice carried a hard edge, fueled by a mix of exhaustion and defiance. He'd left the colonial fleet to escape corporate wars, but now one had found him. And he wasn't backing down. Lila nodded, clutching the knife she'd bloodied in their last fight. "What's the plan?" "They'll send soldiers next, humans with guns, not just beasts." "Then we hit them first," Jake replied. "The wreck's got power cells, maybe weapons. We'd rig something big, turn their hunt into our trap." He glanced at her, catching the flicker of resolve in her eyes. She'd been prey too long. Now she was a fighter. And that shift stirred something in him. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. They crested the ridge, and the wreck came into view. A jagged skeleton of twisted metal half swallowed by the jungle. The scout ship's hull gleamed dully under the morning light, its cockpit shattered and vines snaking through the gaps. Jake's chest tightened at the sight. He crashed it on purpose, faking his death to escape the fleet, but it still held pieces of his old life. Tools, tech, and memories he buried. "Home, sweet home," he muttered, sliding down the slope. Leela followed, her movements fluid despite the rough terrain. They reached the wreck, and Jake pried open a side hatch, revealing a dark interior littered with debris. "Let's see what we've got." Inside, the air smelled of rust and damp earth. Jake flicked on a handheld light, sweeping it over the wreckage. The power core hummed faintly in the engine bay, a miracle it still worked. Leela crouched near a console, brushing dirt from a cracked screen. "This is old tech," she said, her fingers tracing the controls. "But I can wake it up. My people built machines like this. Better ones." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're full of surprises. Do it." He rummaged through storage lockers, pulling out a dented rifle, a few plasma grenades, and a coil of high-tensile cable. "This'll help. We can't outgun a retrieval team, but we can outsmart them." Leela tapped the console, and it flickered to life, casting a green glow across her face. "Power's low, but stable. If we were routed, we could charge something big. A weapon, maybe." Her voice held a quiet excitement, the scientist in her shining through. Jake grinned. "I like where this is going. How about an EMP pulse? Knock out their tech, ships, guns, everything." He'd seen EMPs cripple fleets in his fleet days. If they could build one here, it'd level the playing field. She nodded, already pulling wires from the console. "Possible. We'd need a strong capacitor, something to hold the charge." Her eyes flicked to the power core. "That could work, but it's risky. One mistake, and it blows us up instead." "Risk's my specialty," Jake said, hauling the rifle and grenades to her side. "You handle the tech. I'll set up a perimeter, slow them down when they land." They worked in sync, a rhythm born from days of survival. Lila stripped the core, rigging a makeshift EMP device with scavenged parts, her hands deft and sure. Jake strung the cable across the clearing outside, rigging it with grenades as a tripwire trap. He climbed the wreck's roof, scanning the sky. Dark shapes loomed on the horizon. 3 dropships, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. "Company's here," he called down. "How's that EMP?" "Almost ready," Layla shouted back, sweat beading on her silver brow. 2 minutes. The console sparked as she connected the final wire, the core's hum rising to a whine. Jake slid down, joining her inside. 2 minutes is all we've got. They're landing." He checked the rifle, half a charge left, and handed her a grenade. "Ever used one of these?" She took it, studying it with a frown. "No, but I learned fast. Pull and throw." "Close enough," he said, a flicker of a smile breaking through his tension. "Stay low. We'll draw them in, then hit the pulse." The ships touched down beyond the trees, their ramps hissing open. Armored soldiers poured out. Vortex Industries grunts in black gear, rifles raised, their visors glinting in the dawn. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Surrender the specimen. Resistance is futile." "Specimen," Leela muttered, her grip tightening on the grenade. "I'm no one's prize." She met Jake's eyes, a silent pact forming. They'd fight or die together. The soldiers advanced, fanning out through the jungle. Jake peered through a hull gap, waiting. "Come on, closer." A boot snagged the tripwire, and the grenades erupted, flinging dirt and bodies into the air. Shouts filled the clearing as the survivors regrouped, firing blindly into the wreck. "Now," Jake yelled. Lila slammed the EMP's trigger, and a shockwave rippled out, a silent blast of energy. The soldiers' rifles sparked and died, their visors going dark. The ship's engines sputtered, crashing back to the ground. For a moment, chaos reigned. Then the troops charged on foot, blades drawn. Jake fired the rifle, dropping 2 before it fizzled out. "Out of juice," he growled, tossing it aside, and grabbing a metal pipe. Leela hurled her grenade, blasting a hole in the enemy line. They fought back to back, Jake swinging the pipe with brutal force, Leela slashing with her knife, her speed a blur. The soldiers were trained, But Jake's raw grit and Leela's alien ferocity kept them at bay. A hulking figure emerged from the smoke, a commander in heavy armor, a plasma blade glowing in his hand. "You're done, deserter," he snarled at Jake. "And you, specimen, you're coming with me." Jake stepped forward, pipe raised. "She's not yours. Never will be." The commander lunged, blade slashing. Jake dodged, slamming the pipe into the man's helmet, denting it. Lila darted in, driving her knife into a gap in his armor. The commander staggered, then fell, his blade sizzling out in the mud. The remaining soldiers hesitated, then fled back to their crippled ships. Jake and Leela stood panting, surrounded by wreckage and bodies. "That's it?" Jake asked, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "Thought they'd be tougher." Leela laughed, a shaky sound of relief. "You're impossible." She dropped the knife, her hands trembling now that the fight was over. "But thank you for everything." Jake shrugged, but his eyes softened. Couldn't let them win. Not after all this. He glanced at the EMP device, still humming faintly. "We've got power left. Could fix one of those ships, get off this rock." Leela's gaze shifted to the horizon. "They'll come back. I'm too valuable. My blood, my genes. I'm the last key to Corrin's secrets. They think it's immortality, but it's more power my people hid from them." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Power? Like what?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'll show you when we're safe, but I'm done running. I want to fight them, take back what's mine. Will you help me?" He looked at her, silver skin, golden eyes, a warrior forged from loss, and felt a spark he hadn't known in years. "Yeah," he said, voice rough but sure. "I'm in. Let's make him regret ever crossing us." They turned to the wreck, salvaging what they could. The jungle glowed around them, a world of danger and beauty, and ahead lay a fight bigger than they'd imagined. Jake didn't know where it would lead, but with Leela at his side, he was ready. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone.